Hey, Chief.
Hey, Cyrus.
How you doing, man?
Not too bad. How are you?
Man, I'm excellent. So, one of my favorite types of movies in general are gangster movies.
Okay.
I feel like there's a lot of just really interesting themes going on with
Sure.
them. The whole concept of the family
Yes.
and how that really can change and corrupt and really uh, force people to act differently than they would normally want to and think about.
Yes.
I recently got the chance to go back and rewatch the Godfather trilogy.
Which is pretty excellent. But,
The first one is so tight as a movie.
Yes.
I mean, I'm just amazed with the performances that they were able to pull out of people.
Mhm.
And then number two, just the story in and of itself. It's such a great movie in and of itself. It's really like two movies in one, if you really think about it.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I just greatly enjoyed it. So I guess the first question to you would be, when was the first time you got the chance to see it? And what was your initial reaction when you did?
I saw it, I think, shortly after high school when I was working at Marvel Comics. Because when you're Marvel Comics, people constantly give you movies or recommend movies to you. So I saw a lot of stuff like that during that time period. Was not a Star Trek fan until everyone's like, you gotta watch Star Trek Next Generation on TV or sorts of stuff. So it was probably like the mid '90s when I really was people were unloading movies to me like crazy, and you kind of started gobble them up. So I saw The Godfather back then, but I've seen it like 2 or 3 more times afterwards.
Right.
I really, in time, grew to appreciate it a lot more as you get older. How well crafted it is as a movie, and then overall as a series, for the most part, held together fairly well. There were some problems and glitches in the last one, Godfather 3, but the rest of them really are very, very well done movies. Done by people who were at the height of their game at the time period.
I would totally agree with that. One of the things I really appreciated about the first movie, especially, was the pacing.
Yes.
Even that opening scene when he's at his daughter's wedding,
yes,
and everyone's coming in to talk to him, you learn a lot about every character very naturally and easily.
Sure.
Even the absence of Michael when they're trying to take the photo tells you a lot about how the Godfather really thinks about his son, saying we're not taking the picture until he's there.
Yep.
That tells you
he was looking for Michael. Where's Michael? Where's Michael? He was almost kind of like a little panicked about that.
Right. Lets you know exactly what he is.
And
on top of that too, you see his friend, the one that gets killed in the middle of the movie.
Yeah.
When he sends him on missions, he's not the smartest guy, but he's very loyal. That's something that you learn about him very quickly.
Yes.
Early on in the movie, you learn about Fredo and just about how disgusting he is early on in the movie.
Sure.
And it's just they just do a great job establishing every character from the beginning.
Yeah, very well thought out.
Right.
Started with, it's almost like they're able to start a movie without action, but there's a lot of action going on.
Correct.
But personal conflicts and information being thrown around.
Yeah.
Having a wedding is very big and extravagant too.
Correct.
So it's very interesting. But here's something else that, because when I saw in the '90s, when they showed the wedding, it didn't feel like it was that big of a deal.
Yeah.
Because of course, as time goes by, we see a lot more celebrity weddings on TV. They become more and more extravagant. But I think from back then, it was considered like a big scene,
especially for Italians.
Yeah, for that time period when they filmed it, it's considered like a big wow type of moment. So it's interesting.
Yes.
In a regard, was kind of also a time capsule of where we were back then versus where we are now. And Godfather is kind of a movie that talks about the bygone eras too.
I would agree. Well, one of the big tension points throughout the entire movie, and this is the shot that started off all the tension or all the action, is the fact that the Godfather, he wanted to do business as it had always been done.
Yes.
He didn't want to move into drugs because he believed that it would bring more heat to everything going on, and he thought that security was more important than the gains that the money would bring it. And so that was a big ideological difference.
Yes.
And because of that, it forced the other guy to want to start going after him. And I think that's an important and interesting thing to consider.
Yes.
So after that, a lot of people die throughout the movie.
Oh, yes.
And there's just so much danger that goes through it all. He gets shot in the middle of the street, and then now suddenly someone else has to take charge.
Yes.
And, there's tension between, what's Michael's older brother's name?
Which you talking about, Sonny?
Sonny, yes. Yeah. He's all about going after people. He's a hothead. And, they even use that against him when they murder him.
Yes.
He's far more predictable. he's easier to try to control.
Yes.
And that's a very, difficult thing for the family to try to overcome.
Mm-hmm.
And so even the fact that they're able to survive this ordeal, they're able to make sure that the father dies at home gracefully, rather than being murdered in a hospital bed or being murdered in the middle of the street.
Yeah, there was some real tension in the scene when they were, when Michael was trying to hide his father in the hospital from the assassins.
Right.
I mean, it's funny. It's a very quiet action sequence, but when you watch it at the time, you're like, "Ooh, what's
going to happen?"
And you're feeling something for a guy who's supposed to be a gangster boss,
right?
That's
it's
very
the sheer
done.
fact that no one was there at that point. He wasn't a gangster boss. He was an old man alone, without anyone to support him.
Sure.
That's interesting.
Brilliantly, conceived sequences,
right?
But that kept tension and your interest going,
right?
Even though not a lot is really happening.
Correct. I mean, even look at Michael. He didn't want to be a part of any of this at the beginning.
Yeah, even he goes, "I'm not like my father. I want to get away with it." That's what he was. That was kind of what he was trying to sell himself off to Kate.
Mm-hmm.
His wife and all that kind of stuff too.
Yeah. I mean, even the fact that he went out there to Sicily and then gets married out there, and he becomes a true Italian. I feel like at that point.
Well, that was the interesting part, because if you look at that part of the movie, it's a totally different movie. It could have been its own little unique movie on its own, but they contained it within a whole Godfather, like a 2-hour movie.
Well, yeah. I think that was one of the things that changed him the most, even outside of what went on with his father.
Sure.
Losing her, even after he had actively pursued her, made him cynical and made him far more dangerous as a person.
Yeah.
Because him not murdering, but getting revenge for not the death, but the actions that were played against his father. That's one thing.
Sure.
But losing his wife, and then after such a short period of time, I think really solidified his character.
Sure.
And he was able to come back to his old girlfriend entirely different than he was before.
Yeah, he came
far
back
more sure of himself.
Yes. Far more darker too, the way you approach it.
Calculated, manipulative too.
Yeah, you're right.
He was perfectly comfortable manipulating her after that point. Where beforehand he wasn't giving her sure answers.
Yes.
Like, oh, I don't know when I'm going to be back. Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen.
Oh yeah.
Even by the end of the movie, he was able to lie to her, in her face without any issue, and she was just happy to hear it, even if she knew it was a lie.
Sure. Yeah, that's it's funny, because you look at the first and the second movie, it really is about the fall of Michael, and how it descends further and further, becoming like the devil himself.
Correct.
And losing everything in the process.
Well, that final scene, right? The scene before the final scene where he is christening the new baby, and he's also having all of these murders carried out.
Yeah.
The juxtaposition.
Sure.
It's brilliant.
Yeah. And the thing is about the way it ends in the second movie. Because I remember I saw the first one. I go, oh, this is pretty good, pretty interesting. First one is a straightforward movie.
Very.
Second one, I remember watching it for the first time. It was kind of like, this is all over the place.
It is.
Because it starts off kind of like another wedding sequence.
Yeah.
And then there's him with business in Cuba. There's also the Senate hearing going on.
Well, I loved the Senate portion.
The Senate portion was really great. And then in there was also the separate story about his father as a younger man. Yeah. Coming up, first coming to America and all that kind of stuff. All those, it felt like it's all over the place. But I remember you're watching that, you're like, I have no idea where this is going. But when the movie was over, and he killed off everybody, it was just him sitting there by himself, kind of looking, you don't even looking kind of in the distance and kind of thinking about things, and you don't know what he's thinking.
Right.
Probably there's some regrets. Probably there's more lies to tell himself. When it closed off that way, you're like, when it was all said and done, you're like, wow, everything kind of came together beautifully and tied it up.
I would be perfectly comfortable with the ending after that, because that in and of itself really is a perfect ending.
Sure, like he was just all alone, lost in his thoughts, and probably still lying to himself, like, I did the right thing.
Well, that's what this kind of life ends you at the end of the day.
Sure.
And that's something that I really like about these kinds of stories, is that sure, they're a power fantasy, but they also often will reveal the ends of this kind of behavior.
They're very strong moral tales.
Yes.
Generally, that's what most gangster movies and stories about.
I agree.
Sort of the people delve into shades of gray, but it's really at the end, there's no shades of gray. It's just all blackness.
It corrupts your soul.
It corrupts you completely. And you live in a lie of some sort. And I remember, it's way interesting because the ending of the second movie was more stronger than the ending of the first movie.
Yes.
Like, you remember that scene where he's sitting here by himself and the movie just closes.
Mm-hmm.
Far more than you can remember the ending of the first one.
Yes, I would agree with that. And the other thing that I really feel about this movie, or this series entirely, is that there's a lot of cinematic quality to the movie and value. You compare this to that terrible movie that came out like a year or two ago, Gotti.
Oh, okay.
It's like night and day. Like, this is like the greatest gangster story of all time.
Yeah.
And then you compare it to something like that,
Sure.
where it's a true story.
Yeah.
But they just strung a lot of scenes together in a boring and uninteresting way.
Interesting you mentioned Gotti, because Godfather 3, they had a John Gotti type of character.
Exactly my point.
They did. And that was kind of more memorable, because I remember seeing it, you're like, oh, that's John Gotti.
Yeah.
Even though he's, it's supposed to be a fictional character.
Mm-hmm.
Godfather 3, I remember watching it, and there are parts I really liked.
Yes.
And there are parts you go, they could have been handled better.
Yes.
I thought part 3 really was highlighted by Andy Garcia's performance in that movie. He was a young upcoming actor. They got him, and the funny thing about him was he looked a little bit like a younger, Al Pacino. They got somebody with that kind of quality.
You definitely got that vibe from him.
Yeah, and they said, I remember at the time they said that the character is supposed to embody sort of his father Sonny's temper, Fredo's sensitivity, and then Michael's determination.
I'll tell you what. That's actually a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
He embodied all of those very well.
And they were supposed to do Godfather 4 with him. But somehow some things never came together. The guy who wrote it, Mario Puzo, died. So they just never committed to doing another one.
Yeah.
But I always thought, which tangent off here a little bit, but I always thought when you watched Ocean's 11, where he plays the mob boss in the casino out in Las Vegas, I always thought that's like a weird continuation of that character. Like, eventually somehow he legitimized the business and ended up in Las Vegas.
Right.
And now there's this heist that's being pulled on his nose. And I remember the performance he had in that was terrifying as a character.
Well, he doesn't do much, but he makes very credible threats.
Yeah, he makes very credible threats. And then you can see that him being an extension of the Michael character in Godfather 4.
Well, here's the thing that gets me about Michael. That was probably his best performance.
Of Al Pacino?
Al Pacino's best performance he's ever done. He became a parody of himself.
He became a parody. He's a caricature of Al Pacino after a while.
Right.
As opposed to putting a real performance where the character is three-dimensional, that you can get his feelings and thoughts across on his face, more than just go, I'm Al Pacino.
And there are times when I love that. You have to admit that I love Al Pacino movies. Yeah. Like, it's just one of those things.
Well, I think Al Pacino became that once he did Scarface. Because that's when he was, it's more fun playing it that way. So
well, I'll tell you what, Scarface changed movies forever.
It did. It did.
I can't think of a gangster story that hasn't been influenced by that.
Sure. More
than that.
Yeah, because if you know about Godfather, it's more subdued, very subtleness of things going on. And then Scarface is the complete opposite, where it's in your face, it was bigger than life. The character wasn't even a real character, it was like a cartoon character.
Well, here's the other thing you have to consider. They're basically playing the opposites. Michael versus the guy in Scarface.
Yeah.
Two entirely different characters.
Different characters.
One is trying to establish order.
Yeah.
The other one was disrupting that order.
Complete chaos, yes. But maybe, I think that's why he took the role too, because it was so drastically different. And two completely different performances. You would never think they're played by the same people either. It's interesting. You watch the movie. Here's the other weird thing about Pacino was that when you see him in the first two Godfather, he's kind of like a really good-looking, well-groomed-looking guy.
Yeah, especially at the beginning of the first one.
Yeah.
You can't even associate that beginning Michael with the one at the end of the movie.
But then when you see him in Scarface, it's a different-looking character.
I would agree.
I don't know if he aged differently or they did the makeup differently, but he was kind of darker, dirtier, more wilder character that came out. Nastier on every level.
Well, I like it when he said he's a political refugee.
Yeah.
Like, I just find that line entirely hilarious.
All the dialogues in Scarface is brilliantly written. We should talk about that movie one of these days and focus on that.
Well, I'll tell you what, it's great, number one.
Yeah.
I completely agree with that. His motivations are entirely different with that movie.
But it's clear cut. That movie's so clear cut.
Very clear.
That movie's almost a one-man show.
It's tight.
Yeah, it's a one-man show. It's just him throughout the beginning to end. He didn't care about any other character. You don't remember anybody else as strongly as him.
Yes, I agree. And if you look at the influence of that movie on pop culture, it's humongous.
It is.
I saw this music video once with the baby in it, and he's a rapper that's pretty popular nowadays. And I was watching the music video. I'm like, wait, this looks like a Scarface scene.
Sure.
The one where he has to go get the drugs and make the trade.
Yeah.
At the hotel. And I'm watching this. I'm like, they are copying that from here. And it was brilliant.
I can tell you why. Because Michael is the character that you watch in the movie, and you don't want to be that character. No. You kind of go, oh, that's no fun to be in his role. But when you see Scarface, that's a fun character there. Kind of like a power fantasy. Everyone wish it can be that bad and that nasty and take on anybody.
That's exactly correct. In Scarface, they say, I can't give you the line exactly, but they're basically saying that because he's disturbing the waters and he's trying to rise too quickly, he'll also get cut down faster.
That's right.
And that's exactly what it is. He's a more interesting character, but he's also putting himself in more danger. He's shortening his own shelf life.
Well, but here's the thing. Al Pacino once in an interview says when he played the character Scarface, there was no shades of gray. It was just black and white.
Yes.
It was like I played him two-dimensionally, like a cartoon character, which is why that character is a lot more fun to watch.
Yes.
He's not like he's a very calculating, thoughtful guy. He just goes, I want this, I'm going to go after it.
He's going to go get it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And he'll do it every way he can. Michael is planning and scheming and then doing things that sometimes as the audience, you don't know what's happening until it's revealed to you.
And it's brilliant.
Yeah, it's just like pieces of puzzle being put together in a movie. That's why those first two Godfather movies are considered like true masterpiece classics.
And they wouldn't; those two characters wouldn't get along together. He could not work under Michael.
No,
that's a simple fact.
No, Al Pacino should reprise those two roles again, do a movie, Scarface versus Michael Corleone. And because they can't do that de-aging thing, they can do both of that.
I just want to see them have a conversation together.
Sure.
Even the locations are really tell you a lot about the characters in themselves.
Yes.
One being down there in Miami, very interesting location.
Oh yeah.
That whole Cuban aspect of it.
Sure.
Everything
during that time period. Yeah. Most of that stuff is really in the 80s. We're not really like that anymore, unfortunately. The culture has changed. Even the whole criminal aspect has changed too. So it's really interesting when you talk about Godfather. It's kind of like a romanticized movie, not just about gangsters, but about that time period.
Yeah.
So which I feel like the Godfather was the 60s and then the 70s.
Yes.
A little bit toward the 80s, toward the end of the second one. And
it fundamentally changes.
Yeah. And then by the third one, they jumped so far ahead. Like it felt like in the late 80s, early 90s. And there was such a big gap. And I think that's also why the third one was a little bit of a disconnect when you watch it.
Well, it's further removed
from
the source material.
Yeah, and then you have several actors that didn't come back to reprise their roles.
Yeah.
One of my favorite performances was the lawyer character.
Oh, he was great.
Yeah, played by Robert Duvall.
Yes. Did
not come back by the third movie, and that was kind of a huge piece missing.
Too busy playing Elf. I'm joking.
Yeah, too playing Elf. But he really, I think, added a lot of weight to the first two movies. Like a really strong supporting performance. That was kind of acted. They say he was the counsel of the family, but he in the first two played a little bit like almost like a bit of a conscience.
Yes.
To Michael, that was missing. That was kind of like, this is how we do business. This is the way it is. He was the only voice of reason that Michael had. Sometimes his reasoning is the wrong reason.
But he tried.
It was interesting. There was something that kind of pulled
I really enjoyed watching him and Sonny interact too.
Yes.
Because they were like oil and water.
Yeah, they were butting heads most of the time. And they were both considered like the older son of the family.
Yes.
So that was kind of what's interesting in the first one. And the second one, he was just completely loyal to Michael. But a lot of times his counseling is the wrong counseling, because he was too cold and calculating in the way he presents the situation.
Well, he's also a bit of a coward.
Yeah,
he was able to rise to the occasion when need be.
Yes.
But he really was risk averse, almost too much at it a certain period of time.
Yeah. So it was interesting that character didn't come back in the third one, because I would love to have him there.
Especially as an older character.
Well, he also wasn't dead as in real life. But he refused to come back. So that was a missing piece in the third one. That would have been real interesting. Where Michael keeps wanting, they couldn't even set up a conflict between him and Michael, where Michael wants to break away. So he keeps wanting to be legitimate.
Mhm.
And then maybe he would have been like, we've been doing things for so long this way, you just can't change anymore.
Yeah.
Like that would have been an interesting voice in that third one.
Well,
they kind of put into Michael's sister, which is even more bizarre because she was a complete victim in the first one. And then second one kind of became a strange it's still a victim, but almost became a liability to Michael in the second one.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, but by the third one, she was kind of running things. She was the devil on his shoulder.
Yeah, pushing him.
Yeah, pushing him to do things. And what they probably wouldn't need is the Robert Duvall character being that angel and the devil that keeps
giving him choices.
Yeah, everybody is manipulating him because he's so powerful now. But then you could have done a story if he's so powerful, he's losing power.
Yes. That's a real problem.
That's a real problem. Yeah.
It's hard to wield it. It's easier to attain it, but it's harder to maintain it and control it. One of the things I was thinking about earlier today too was this. Mm-hmm. Gangster stories, like you were saying, really are from a previous generation.
Sure.
Really where the crime syndicates are moving right now are really cartels.
Yes.
And everything going on there. And cartels operate fundamentally differently than gangs.
Yes.
And so if they were to try to tell a modern day gangster tale, it would be rather difficult.
It is much more violent because part of what people don't realize is gangsters the American gangsters, a lot of them kind of gone legit.
Yes.
Because they have so much money, they can kind of hide behind the celebrity scenes now. And our government is always kind of, doing a lot of backhand dealings with them, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. It becomes easier to legitimize.
Yes. And
not be so front and center, and they're kind of, and the weird thing is like American Gangster kind of became part of American institution. Like you can't separate them anymore. But yes, the gangster we kind of know as the bad guys now are the cartels that's sending in drugs from South America.
Well, to your first statement, what do you think a government is?
Well,
well,
it is that.
I'm a chill, but no, seriously. I mean, a government is someone that's able to have a monopoly on violence.
Yes.
Check. That's what gangs are.
Yeah.
Number two, they're able to tax people.
Yeah, take people's money. Yeah. I know that's what they are. I mean, but that's why it's easy for the two to marry together.
Right, because they already do the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. And morals and as a society we've moved more and more into morality gray area now.
Well, sure. And then you have to think about this too. If you're a gang at one point, you don't want to crush your tax base.
No.
You offer protection to them.
Sure.
Because number one, that makes them more loyal to you.
Yes.
And they're actually more likely to support you and give you favors, which is important, especially if you're operating in the system. And then number two, you need to be able to do this. Gangs can't really exist if they can't bribe politicians and other kinds of officials.
No, they can't.
They can't.
Yeah.
And so it's the sheer fact that there's a flaw in our system that allows them to operate in the first place.
Yes.
Compare that to cartels, which can act extrajudiciously. They act over many different countries' borders.
Yes.
And they're able to move drugs or anything else that they want to.
Yeah, drugs and people.
They're a far more dangerous kind of person to deal with because they don't care about you.
Sure.
They're willing, ready, and able to sacrifice you because they can act anywhere.
Yes. Yeah, so it's interesting. Like Godfather movie really is a bygone era.
Yes.
Not just gangsters, but America itself, the way we operated, and the way even families are kind of portrayed in these things. And then it's interesting because I know they could never do a Godfather 4 at this point. No. Some of the actors are too old and. Nobody I think is dying for one because when you bring it back, it wouldn't even be the same anymore.
Well, it's fundamentally different, and you have to think about the racial component too.
Sure.
What's it called? These gangs in general too.
Yeah.
The Godfather.
Yes.
Very heavily Italian.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
One of my other favorite movies, American Gangster. Love that movie.
Sure.
I think it's great. Yeah. That's heavy black.
Yes.
And those gangs even fundamentally operated differently than black gangs traditionally.
Yeah. And then there's the and then there's I think the Irish gang, what you saw in Miller's Crossing.
100%.
Different type of mentality too.
Mm-hmm.
But gangster, it's funny. Our public perception of gangster really is fundamentally different now than the way it is. Like movies present these very simple, almost cartoon-like characters now when they do them.
Yeah.
But in real lives, it's far more complicated than that.
Well, sure. there's a certain amount of sophistication that takes to be able to be a criminal organization for that long and be that successful.
That's right.
It's one thing to be a semi-successful or rather unsuccessful criminal. You don't have to be as legit or as smart about how you're doing things.
Yes.
It's another thing to get huge success because then you actually have to internalize your processes like a real business would.
Oh, yeah.
In a way that you wouldn't have to otherwise.
Sure. You know, it's interesting because they don't also do movies about like Asian gangs that often. I mean,
I'll see them in like Chinese or Korean shows,
but not in America.
Correct.
What we used to do, there used to be a movie. There was a movie. Dolph Lundgren, I think, was in it, called Showdown Little Tokyo, was about Japanese yakuza.
Right. Wasn't that in San Francisco?
Yeah, San Francisco, right. which is really where they operated, where there's a heavy Japanese population. Like America used to tap into that type of idea.
Well, those stories are interesting too.
Yes,
because there's that same sort of dynamic that you have with other kinds of gangs, where there are people living here in the U.S. They're U.S. citizens quite often. Yeah, but they don't necessarily see themselves.
Oh yeah. So it's like I felt like in the modern day sense, they're even losing the idea how to do different types of gangsters movies. Which I would love to see some of that come back through the Yakuza stuff. The Yakuza itself has changed drastically too as an organization.
Well, they've improved their public image greatly.
Yes,
drastically they've improved.
Oh yeah, they did
over the years.
So I think it'll be interesting to see somebody tackle some of these projects, nowadays, because it's weird. It feels like there are still, not that there are not gangsters movies done. Talk about Empire being one of them that was on I think HBO a few years ago. Right. Still hit it pretty big, but I was like, do something where it's modern day and ties a little bit to what's really going on, as opposed to these older fashioned romanticized gangster movies.
Well, a lot of it is because they were rather successful in becoming legitimate, as you said.
Sure.
And that fundamentally changes the way in which you operate.
Yeah.
I mean, think about terrorists or other kinds of insurgent groups that are able to actually get legitimized power within a region. Yeah. They suddenly are no longer fighting against the system. They become incorporated.
They become part of it.
And when you become a part of the system, you are no longer who you used to be.
That would be interesting if somebody does a political gangster movie where it's really heavily tied into that. I think that would be quite fun to see if it's handled well.
Sure, yeah. I mean, and the other problem too is at one point, the extra money becomes too much of a risk if you really consider it. You have enough money, you're in a great political and financial position. Trying to go back out there and do the old stuff that you used to do is too dangerous because you have enemies.
It is. Yeah, that's why fundamentally nothing in The Godfather exists anymore. Yeah. It's changed drastically. So it's kind of interesting when people should watch those movies.
I agree.
They're time capsules of a time period of the people, the way they operate, the way they think.
Right.
And they're very strong tales of morality.
Right.
And there's some sense of family. And how families within itself can manipulate and tear itself apart and do things to each other, going through tragedies and losses and even moments of happiness is what you see in these Godfathers.
Little times.
Little times, yeah.
But no, they're a great series. I would highly recommend it. It's an interesting genre that I feel has been underutilized currently.
Yeah. And
there's a lot of opportunity there. But, with everything going on in the world and how things are changing, we definitely need to really update how it's being portrayed.
Sure.
Who knows? Thank you guys for watching. We appreciate it. Let us know what your first experience was watching The Godfather. What other gangster movies do you enjoy? And let us know what you think a current movie would even look like nowadays. We'd appreciate any and all of that.
Sure.
Absolutely.
We'll see you guys again next time.
Thanks for watching.